Hey everyone, Dockwell here, and welcome to another one of my Dota 2 hero guides. Today we're going to be taking a look at Visage. Visage is a unique and interesting hero who mostly plays off lane these days, but he can also be played mid, and you don't really see this hero in low-level pubs all that much because it can be complicated to play and understand. And you could actually categorize Visage as a cheesy hero for hero specialists similar to Meepo or Arc Warden, and that's largely because there is a decent amount of micro involved. However, the micro for Visage isn't all that complicated, and the builds on this hero can be fairly straightforward. But the real reason why this hero is so difficult is because it can be challenging to take advantage of his strengths while also avoiding his weaknesses. Visage can be a great lane dominator, an extremely fast tower pusher, and also great at 1v1 fights. Visage is also very tanky, but in a strange and unique way, and I'll get into this in more detail when we talk about the abilities, but essentially you don't want to tank everything like some kind of traditional beefy offlaner like maybe a Centaur, but you also don't want to be in the back of the fight just trying to right click and do damage because you are tanky to some extent, and you do want to soak some of those abilities, and oftentimes you will be building aura items that make you even tankier. So you really need to be walking this fine line between feeding and surviving while also tanking some spells and dealing a ton of damage, and that can be a really tricky line to walk. And the real skill is knowing where that line is in each matchup and against each hero and in each team. But before we can understand how to play Visage, we have to take a look at his abilities. Now let's take a look at Visage's abilities and see how he's able to be that unique hero that is also a micro-based hero. So first we can take a look at Grave Chill. This is a pretty straightforward ability actually. You just cast it on an enemy hero or an enemy creep or a jungle creep, and it debuffs them and makes them slower and also steals their attack speed. So they're debuffed, they're losing attack speed, and then you're also gaining attack speed. So this is really good obviously for harassing, for doing extra damage, and even for farming in general, because if you're farming a creep wave or you're farming a creep camp, you can just cast this on one of the creeps and then you're going to farm quicker because you're going to attack faster, do more damage, that kind of stuff. So it's a really straightforward ability, but you're probably going to be spamming this a lot, especially once you have it leveled up to max. So that's Grave Chill, again, pretty straightforward. Then next we can take a look at Soul Assumption, and this is the ability that allows you to do a ton of magic damage early on in the lane and also in these big team fights. So how does this work? Well, it's basically another single target ability that you just cast on an enemy, and then a soul comes out and does a little bit of damage, and that's just the base damage. But how do you actually make this do more burst damage? Well, you can see there's these lines above this hero's head, and these are stacks that build up when any hero takes damage, both allied heroes and enemy heroes. So basically this axe has a rapier, he'll click this axe, and you can see a bunch of stacks are now built up, and then I consume them to actually use Soul Assumption and do more damage to this enemy axe. The same thing is true in reverse, so we can see this axe is going to click this one, he takes a ton of damage, and then I get full stacks, and then I can use it again to do even more damage. And so this is obviously going to be building up as you do harass damage in the lane. You know, people are trading back and forth, or in team fights, there's initiations, people trying to get killed, and you're just going to spam this out a ton of times in fights because it has such a low cooldown. This is going to have insane impact. It's actually ridiculous how much damage this can do in the lane and in fights. It's kind of absurd to deal with. It's really, really hard to deal with because it has a pretty long range, and you're going to just like delete heroes with this, especially how many times you can actually get it off in a fight. You can get it off like 10 times in a fight. It feels like it's ridiculous. So that's Soul Assumption. The other part that I'll quickly add about it is if you look at this description here, there's a facet that you're probably going to be picking for the most part until they change something that makes this also kind of a farming ability because you get extra gold when you get kills on heroes and on creeps. So you can also use this and spam it out in the jungle or when you're last hitting and pushing lanes and stuff like that to get a little bit of extra gold on creeps and stuff like that as well. So it's not just a damage item that you're going to be using in team fights, at least for now when you pick this facet. Then lastly, for the normal abilities, we have Gravekeeper's Cloak, and this is the ability that makes you pretty tanky, kind of the thing that makes you able to be an offlaner, as well as your burst damage and your good laning presence, but still, this makes you pretty tanky, but it's not like super tanky overall, like maybe a Centaur, like I said, or even an Axe here, a normal strength hero that can just take a ton of damage because they have high HP. This is kind of like TA's Refraction in that you take less damage initially, but once those charges are gone, you take a lot of damage. You're pretty squishy, actually. So I'll show you how that works. Basically, there's these layers, and you have this buff here, and then once those layers are gone, you take full damage, and each time you take an instance of damage, you remove a layer, and then you have to kind of stay out of a fight or not take much damage for a while, and then those layers will build up. So I'll just show you how this works by having this axe attack me. So he has a rapier, and you can see for the first few attacks, it does less damage, but as these charges go away, he will be doing more damage. So you can see that initial damage is not very much, but then as the charges go away, he does a ton of damage. And so that's why this hero is a little bit tricky, because you want to kind of be in the front of the fight to some extent, because once you have all these charges, you really don't take much damage at all. I mean, that's a rapier, and you can see that first hit or two does almost no damage, but then the damage reduction kind of decreases with each layer. So these layers are stacked on top of each other. So that first instance of damage at max level basically only does 20% damage, which is kind of insane. That's a huge damage reduction, probably the most damage reduction in the game for just anything. Like, you can't really get more damage reduction than that other than just like pure damage block, which is kind of crazy. But then you can see after those 4 hits, this hero gets extremely squishy. So that's why it's a hard line to kind of walk, and you don't want to cross over that line, get too in front, because if you take a bunch of instances of damage, you're just going to die quickly. But you do want to tank a couple spells, a couple right clicks, and you can be tanky in a lot of different situations, as long as they don't commit everything onto you and burst you full to 0 after a few instances. So it's a little unique in that way. It's kind of hard to walk that line. It takes a lot of experience and understanding of matchups and all that kind of stuff. But in certain games, especially where there are just like big instances of damage and not a lot of like damage over time and those kinds of things, you can be an extremely tanky and formidable force with this Gravekeeper's Cloak. And then lastly, we have Summon Familiars. So you can just press this ability, and then the familiars come out of the ground. And then this is a pretty long cooldown ability. It's kind of like Spirit Bear in that way for Lone Druid, where once you summon them, it starts counting down. And then once it's available again, you can re-summon them. You would either want to do that if they died, because they have health bars and they can take damage, or if they're in a dangerous situation, you just want to recall them back to your hero, if maybe they're split pushing or out on the map or something like that. And these are flying units, so they go over trees, they go over cliffs. You can also control them individually, which is pretty good. And if you're going to play this hero, you're going to want to have hotkeys for control groups, like select all units to toggle through the units, maybe one for just your birds and then individual birds, that kind of stuff. And like I said, if you're going to play this hero, you really want to have all these control groups and have it be second nature, so you don't really have to think about it. And that's one of the skill parts of heroes like this, where you don't want to be thinking, oh, I need to select my, units, and how do I do that? And like looking down at the keyboard, you just want it to be second nature, ingrained in your brain how to do that. And that takes some time and some practice. Now, these birds are really good for doing right-click damage, obviously, because they're just individual units that can right-click, but they have their own health bars, and they share Grave Chill when you use that, and they share in Gravekeeper's Cloak. But you can see there's an AoE here on Gravekeeper's Cloak, because, let me just like kind of scoot up here a little bit and have that in range. We can have one bird go here on this side of the axe, and then one here on this side of the axe, and be in the range of my Gravekeeper's Cloak. And you can see when this axe with the rapier clicks that bird, it doesn't do much damage. When it clicks that bird, it does a ton of damage, okay? So that's because these birds need to be in range of this hero in order to get these benefits. Then if they are low HP, you can also press this hotkey, which is R for this hero, and they stun in an AoE, which is good for locking heroes down, doing some extra damage, but it also regens all of their health once they go down into the ground, and they're invulnerable for a certain period of time until they come back up, and then you can use them to fly away or something like that. So keep that in mind. You can use 2 stuns in a row, obviously, but then you don't have your birds doing extra damage. But at that point, maybe use a Soul Assumption, have a Grave Chill, right click, your teammates follow up, all that kind of stuff. Then the other thing to notice is that you don't necessarily have to select each individual bird and press stone form to make them stun. You actually, when you are selecting your hero, you can just press D here, stone form, it'll make the bird closest to you go down into the ground and stun and heal. So you can press it twice, and then since I don't have free spells on, you can see the stone form is on cooldown based on the cooldown of, the most recent bird that did that stun, or the last bird that did the stun. And it's a pretty low cooldown spell that you can use fairly often. Obviously, once you use it and then you start right-clicking with the bird again, people are probably going to try to turn on the bird and kill them, so then you want to use it again. You can use it a bunch of times in fights, or use it to heal up and then escape the birds if the fight is over. And then you can also just re-summon them if you want, and then they come back to you if you think they're in danger or something like that, so just keep that in mind. And then I'm going to talk about the Ags and the Shard. So I already bought the Shard here, and you can see it makes Gravekeeper's Cloak a castable ability. It basically makes you able to do that stone form AoE stun like your familiars do, but on your normal hero. So let's actually have him take some damage here. I'll show you what it does. Okay, so now he's damaged a little bit, and now I can press Gravekeeper's Cloak. I will go back into the ground, stun in an AoE, and I will start healing just like my familiars do for that pretty decent duration. And it's a pretty decent heal, and then I can fly away, just like the familiars can. It's basically the same thing. You just kind of become like one of your familiars. It has a pretty long cooldown though, so keep in mind you probably only use it one time in the fight. Then lastly, we have the Ags, and when you buy this, you get another ability here, Silent as the Grave, and when you press this, you and your familiars become invisible, and then you also get this flying like your familiars do, so you can go over cliffs and over trees, and then basically when you pop out of Invis, you do a ton of extra damage, you and your familiars, for a duration there that makes you just do a crazy amount of damage. It's basically really good for ganking, really good for split pushing, and then obviously you have the ability to heal yourself by going in the ground if you ever need to escape or if you get in trouble. So this hero, as you get more of these abilities, Ags and Shard, and more right-click items, you start to be able to split push extremely effectively, do a ton of right-click damage in addition to your magic damage early on in the lane and in team fights. Now, before we jump into a game, we actually have to talk about the facets and the passive. Basically, I already sort of talked about this death toll facet, and this is the one you're going to be picking in pretty much every game, at least right now until they change things up. This one is the one that allows you to get more gold with kills from Soul Assumption, both on heroes and on creeps, so it just like beefs up this hero's ability to farm quicker. Then you have Faithful Followers. You're probably not going to pick this one ever. Maybe if you want to try the hero out, you can maybe pick this. This basically makes the micro on this hero not as important because your familiars will just follow you around, but that's really not that great because part of the strength of the hero is having the familiars and microing them either to split push or also just in the fight in general to make them kind of annoying and control exactly where they're going. It also makes stunning with those familiars not as easy because they just kind of go to wherever you attack, whoever you're attacking, and that isn't always what you want to be doing with your familiars. So you're probably not going to be picking this unless you're just figuring out what you want to play or if you like the hero in general, that kind of stuff. And then this Sepulture one is not great either. It's just better to have the money from Death Toll. This allows you to, you know, recall the familiars, which can be okay. It's really not that big of a deal. And then also Grave Chill is sort of an AoE as well, which can be good, but it's really just better to get more gold on the hero and get more items. Really, that AoE effect does not have that much impact. And then the Lurker passive also is just pretty straightforward. You just get ability cooldown whenever you're not taking damage. It's really just that straightforward. I'm not going to go into all the details, but as you don't take damage from heroes and stuff, your abilities are just lower cooldown, which does help if you're kind of in the back line in a team fight, not taking damage. You can even spam Soul Assumption even more than you already could. So it's pretty good in that way, but it's a pretty straightforward ability that you don't really need to think about that much. That's Visage. Those are his abilities. Now let's jump into a game and see how he's played. Now, the laning stage on Visage is really all about Soul Assumption. Players will often underestimate how much damage this ability really does, especially because they don't see Visage very much in pubs. Maybe higher MMR pubs, when this hero is good, it's picked a lot, but for the most part, if you're below Immortal, you're not going to see Visage all that often. So yes, you're going to get tankier later in the game, but early game is really all about spitting out those Soul Assumptions, doing insane amounts of damage. People will just go about their normal lane, harassing, last hitting, and then all of a sudden a giant Soul Assumption charge comes in and they just feed because they were not expecting that amount of damage. And so that's what you're going to be focusing on in the lane for the most part, because you're going to win trades simply because Soul Assumption is building up as you're trading, both when they're hitting you, when they're hitting your ally, and when you're hitting them. So that's just really the focus of the lane. You're going to get 1 point in maybe your other abilities to get a little tanky, get a little extra attack speed, that kind of stuff, but it's really all about Soul Assumption until you hit level 6. Then once you do hit level 6, that's your first big timing, because for the most part, if you know what you're doing, the enemy that you're laning against cannot stand toe-to-toe against you because you're going to be building up all of those Soul Assumption charges and you're probably maxing that ability first. And so if they try to take some damage or harass you, then you're just going to burst them down. You also have those 2 stuns, and then you can also push the tower extremely quickly. The only real way to deal with you is to bring more heroes, you know, burst you down, gank you with a bunch of stuns and that kind of stuff. So you do still have to be wary. You're not like unkillable, but for the most part, if you have good map awareness, you can take extreme advantage of these timings once you hit level 6 to push towers, just to do a ton of damage, maybe to get a lot of kills, maybe gank kills, those kinds of things. As long as you have numbers or you're like 1v1 or 2v2, you're probably going to win a lot of those team fights. Then once the lanes start breaking down and people are moving around the map, you know, supports are getting 6, that kind of stuff, you really need to evaluate the game state, because hopefully, and kind of the goal on this hero, is that you dominated your lane, you probably took the enemy tower, and then that allowed you to move around the map, rotate, help the other lanes, and kind of snowball the game. And that's the ideal, but that's not going to happen every single game. So once it gets to 10, 15 minutes, you really need to start thinking about, okay, where do you fit? Are you going for this aura build? You're just helping out your team in team fights, but you need to be careful because you don't want to just run in, think you're super strong, and then get ganked with numbers like 4 heroes, and then they kill you, and then that happens a few times, and then you don't really have a game. Because you can farm pretty quickly with your familiars, with your Soul Assumption. You want to make sure that you're not pushing yourself too far to try to get stuff happening on the map when your team just isn't ready or they're not strong enough because they didn't have great early games. Then once you evaluate that and you say, okay, we're really strong, we're going to snowball, we're going to take map control, or we're kind of going to sit back, we're going to play a little passive, we're going to maybe just defend towers and be a little bit more reactionary, then that's when you know, okay, I'm playing for more of the late game timings, the split pushing, that kind of stuff if you're on the back end, or maybe you're just snowballing out of control, you're going for full aura items, and you guys are going to push racks at 20, 25 minutes. That is kind of the extremes, either or, of Visage for the most part, because he has this weird mid-game timing where you can be extremely strong if you're snowballing, but if you're not, you kind of need to shift your focus to playing for more of the late game and split pushing and kind of then defending high ground, having good team fights, and then pushing extremely quickly once you do win those late game team fights if you guys are on the back foot. And then team fighting with Visage is also the other place that you're going to start to think about matchups and who's on the enemy team and who's on your team and about what your role in the game is going to be. Now, for the most part, you don't want to have to be a frontliner, but if that's what you're going to be and that's what you need to be because, you know, you have a bunch of squishy supports and you have squishy ranged cores for your other positions, maybe you just need to go all aura items, get an early shard, and just try to be as tanky as possible. You can do that. It's a little bit difficult, but that's when you go, you know, aura items, BKB, and shard, and you just don't really focus as much on right-click damage, maybe just getting out soul assumption charges, and then letting your team get off as many spells as possible. But then in other games, you can go more for an aura build or a right-click build and kind of mix those two things up, and then you want to play that fine line between not sitting in the back too much. You don't want to just, you know, click heroes from the back line, but you also want to get in a little bit and be tanky. And then maybe in other games, your role is to just, you know, wait for the back line, maybe get an Ags, be invis, get an Orchid or something, and then just go for the supports and kill them because there's not really much mobility on your team or something like that. You know, people don't really have the capability to get in the back line, and you're the backline killer. So in every game, depending on matchups, depending on hero composition, your role can be different, and that's where it can get really hard with this hero because you can be extremely tanky, you can kind of be this frontliner, but you can also do insane damage. You can kill the backline, you can try to fight the cores. You can do so many different things depending on the build, depending on the matchups, that is really where the skill of this hero comes in. Getting the most out of the early advantage, crushing the lane, then evaluating, you know, am I going to be very aggressive with my team or sit back and kind of be a little bit more passive? And then in team fights, how am I going to execute that? And that is all something that comes with experience and understanding matchups and understanding the hero in depth. And that takes a lot of time. And that's why this hero can be a more complicated hero to play. And then in terms of ideal team fight in the ideal lineup, you don't want to be in the front line initiating, you don't want to be in the back line, like I said, like a drow or something just clicking. You want to be kind of right in the middle of the fight so that you can follow up on any initiation, or you can kind of save with pipe or with greaves or any of these other aura items if somebody gets initiated on your team, and then you're spamming out soul assumptions as much as possible, using all of your abilities, and then using your familiars to pick at the enemy team or even fly at the supports and annoy and harass them, and then stun as soon as they try to turn on them and kill them, and just be really annoying with all of your abilities and your familiars. That's kind of the ideal team fight. And then other team fights, you know, maybe later on in the game in these super late game lineups, you're going to be using your Ags, and maybe you have, you know, an Orchid or something like that, and then you can just straight up go for a single target kill really quickly on someone and then play the middle of the fight, like I said, especially after it already kind of broke out. But you really don't, for the most part, want to be the frontliner or the initiator because that's really not your role, even though you do play offlane a lot with this hero. Then in the ultra late game, this hero is insane at taking towers, probably takes towers faster than almost any hero in the game, and you're great at split pushing. So if you're on the back foot and you need to turtle it up, that can be really good because you are an aura builder, a good team fighter. So sometimes you can just wait for that one team fight high ground to win, and then you will push base extremely quickly. You know, let's say the enemy hasn't taken any racks, they try to push racks, and then you kill them all. You will probably take their racks before they spawn, unless it's super early in the game, and you know they respawn really quickly. And then if you're on the back foot and it's super late and you have a bunch of items, you can go more for the right-click items, not just the aura items, and then go invis with your Ags, split push on the side lanes, draw the enemy back, take the racks before they even take your racks. All that kind of stuff is ways to just draw out the game and make it extremely annoying to deal with this hero later on once you become really adept at just playing on the hero's limits and playing on that razor's edge. And you can honestly solo win games with that kind of play style with this hero. And then if you ever get that one advantage, you know, one hero doesn't have buyback on the enemy team, that's core to their winning, and then you just take the racks or you just take the throne and you just win the game that probably you shouldn't win because you were just being so annoying, split pushing, and being hard to deal with for the enemy. So I think you can see how Visage can be an extremely strong hero when he's in the right hands, but it takes a lot of games and a lot of experience to really know how to get the most out of the hero. But when you play against a Visage that really knows what they're doing, it can feel almost impossible to win because there's so many different things that this hero can do to have insane impact early, middle, and late in the game. And so that is why this is probably one of the best heroes to solo carry the game. So if you want to play a micro hero or want to play one of these cheesy heroes, Visage is a great one to learn. But you do need to learn the hero because it takes a lot of games to understand all the situations and even get used to that micro, so it is second nature. So Visage might be the way to go if you're one of those micro cheesy kind of heroes that want to solo carry games and you want to be a hero specialist. And that, everyone, is my Visage guide. If you liked the video or found it helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.